Hey there everybody, it's Mark Curley. I'm back with another How to Draw video. This is the 9th in a series of videos about how to draw animals. I've done one on a wolf, a kitten, a dog, a tiger, a fish, and so forth. And today we are going to be doing one on how to draw a lion. Now you can see that I have a perfect square here. It is about 2.5 inches on all sides. That works out to right around 6.5 centimeters. But you can make it any size you want, so long as it's a perfect square. Now you can see that I've split it into 4 smaller squares by way of these intersecting lines. And right now I'm going to add just a few more lines before we get into drawing the various facial features. Alright, so you can see I've drawn a larger square here. It is about 5 inches from side to side, so you're basically doubling the size of this square. And then I've put an extra line here that's exactly halfway between. This is going to help us for placing the ears later on. This is all for the facial features, and this square out here helps us figure out drawing the lion's mane later on. But I just wanted to point out the size of all of this before we get going, because you want to make sure you have plenty of space all around the square, even below, as you begin working on this project. Well, let's go ahead and zoom in and start working on the facial features of the lion. So this line basically delineates the contour of the face, where the longer hairs of the mane begin to grow. And hopefully the square down here, if you look at the space, these shapes on either side, that can help you sort of get those lines in the right place. And notice that it kind of comes down to, I guess you'd call a widow's peak here, just in the center, the dead center of the lines there. And let's go ahead now and begin to draw the shapes of the eyes. So here you see this unusual shape around the edge of the eye, in which it sort of looks like a tear duct is pointing down at an angle and then more or less straight across over here. And then the eye itself is really not all that large. You'll want to pay attention to, that initial square and its placement just a little to the left of the center of that square. And then, of course, we're going to have to reproduce this in the same location, just flipped around on the other side. So you can see that having these squares in place can help you to get that distance in there between the eyes, because they are pretty widely spaced. Well, let's move on now to drawing the nose. Alright, well, this shape of the nose is really quite unusual, and I came up with this based on studying photographs, and it became quite an educational process for me to see how different the lion's nose is from, say, the wolf's nose. These extra sort of horn-like shapes out here at the edge make it quite different, and presumably this allows scent to come in from the left and the right into the nostrils. Well, do your best to replicate this shape. The one thing that I noticed was how kind of perfectly symmetrical and curving this line is as it comes down to just really a super fine point down there, and then basically you're just trying to replicate this slightly wider curve in the center compared to these narrower curves over on the sides. Well, I think we're ready to finally move on to drawing the mouth and the chin. Now, one thing that I noticed as I was learning to draw the chin was that the hair is considerably longer on the chin than it is on the rest of the face, almost sort of beard-like when you get down to this area, whereas the whole rest of the face, the fur is really quite trim. And then you want to pay attention, of course, to the size and shape of the sort of snout of the region, as I tend to call it. And again, the squares, are just helping you for placing all of this stuff. The nose rests upon that center line, and this shows you the extent of the chin and so forth. This area in here is really just going to be all blackened in, as is this area around the nose as well later on. But let's go ahead and add just a little bit of detail here across the snout. And later on we're going to have whiskers coming out of here, but I'm going to kind of go back in and erase a little bit the upper and lower line. Really, those two center rows seem to be the most clearly defined to me. In these upper areas it starts to fade. The upper and lower area starts to fade a little bit. Well, I'm going to refocus the camera so that we can start to get to the ears and the shape of the mane. All right, well, the shape of the mane is kind of amorphous and quite changeable, depending on which way the wind is blowing. But the ears can kind of anchor us in the drawing here. So let's go ahead and put in the lines of the ears. So much of the ears are going to be defined later on by way of shading and rendering the fur, but I guess I can say one thing for sure about them is that they are very much rounded ears. They don't come to a point the way that, say, a wolf's ears do. And otherwise, you just want to make sure you get the placement here, and that's why I put in this initial square, basically, so that you can sort of see the distance between these two lines in terms of placing it, and also pay attention to the height, as it crosses above this midway line just a little bit, but most of it, the lion's share. Sorry, I couldn't resist that terrible joke. Of the ear is beneath that central line. Well, let's go ahead and get some lines in here for the lion's mane. All right, well, I think you could consider these lines almost like placeholder lines. This is not the final shading. I'm going to put a lot of time into refining the fur later on, but this helps give you the basic idea of the extent of it. And notice how the hair at the top of the head does not quite reach that upper line of the square. That sort of helps you see the extent of that, whereas it does cross quite far below the line for the chin there. So basically I'm going to be refocusing, and you probably won't even see this line up here anymore because it's not so important after this stage in the video. Well, I want to zoom in now and begin to draw the eyes. Okay, well, we can finally knock it off with the time lapse and get into some real-time drawing here. I'm switching to my trusty black Prismacolor, just a simple black colored pencil, to begin darkening in this area all along the edge of the eye. I believe that this black area helps the lion's eyes to focus, kind of like, with football players will put, black markings underneath their eyes to sort of keep the sun out. And I learned that by reading the comment section of my wolf video, where a lot of people were sort of educating me about the purpose of this blackness all around the edge of the lion's eyes. But as I studied photos from this point of view anyway, it's not completely equal in width all the way around the eye. It seems to me you get a certain thickness here on the left edge of it, and it narrows a bit as you get over onto the right-hand side. Now, the pupil of the lion's eyes is quite small, at least again in the photos that I studied, and I'm going to put it just a little bit to the right, because I think what happens is, and I'm going to switch now to my trusty Dixon Ticonderoga. A little harder for me to say that compared to black Prismacolor, but the shading comes in here, and in a lot of the photos that I studied, it gets a little obscured in this upper area and staying quite pale in the lower part of the eye. So the shading becomes pretty important here. Otherwise you end up with this slightly bug-eyed looking lion. And even having added the shading, it still is looking a little weird to me. I think the more we build this up and maybe even blend in a bit with the black Prismacolor, the closer we can get it to looking natural. Now, of course you want to try to get this shape down accurately, but another aspect of it is the sort of fur in the immediate area of the eye, which has a particular pattern, at least in the photos I studied, a very whitish area of fur just below, all along this edge. And you can begin, although we're not going to get into shading in the whole area of the cheeks quite yet, you can begin to sort of delineate that if you like, just to sort of remind yourself to stay out of this area when it comes to shading. It really is quite pale in that area. Not so along the upper edge, where the fur comes in pretty close, and it's a little more gradual as it goes from that black almost eyeliner kind of a area, and begins to move into the, as I said, sort of very tightly cropped hair that, or fur that covers the entire face. Now, I also noticed a sort of a whitish region just over here to the right of this eye. And, you know, different lions are probably going to have different patterns, and I'm going to get into the shading of the face and the mane as much as I can in this video. Shading is a very time-consuming process, but I'm going to do what I can in terms of covering significant parts of that in real time. And happily, we have a sort of another mirror image situation here, so that I can just go ahead and shade in this eye over here exactly the same way. Okay, so you can see I decided to erase the guidelines before I got too much further into the shading area, but I thought I'd point out one other little detail that you can add if you want to. Again, can't say if this is true of all lions, but in some of the photos I saw almost a sort of eyebrow-like pattern here. Of course, it is not an eyebrow. I think it's just darkness in the fur, but just above either eye, just a little black line there again in some of the photos that I saw. And we're going to, you know, be getting into a lot of shading all in this whole area later on, but for now let's start moving into rendering the nose, and I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the black colored pencil. I think it is rather important in doing a good illustration of a lion to get yourself some source of jet black. Now, you know, I'm using a black colored pencil, but there are other ways of doing it, I suppose. You could be using paint of some kind. You may try to, you know, follow along with this using ink, whatever technique you use, or indeed doing it all digitally on the computer. This is the area where you really want to go to black. Not so much in the front tip of the nose, but this whole area beneath the nose. In fact, because this really is just all about blackening it in, rather than squander my precious real-time video section, I'll go ahead and complete just the black areas in time-lapse. So there are other areas that go to jet black as well, but I thought I'd stop here having got these areas in, and just notice how much it comes to kind of a point here and here, and then also down here. I was struck by that, something I had never really noticed about a lion's nose until I started studying these photographs. So I'm going to go ahead and shade in here. It's really a mix of pink and black, again in the type of lion that I was studying. But since I'm doing this in black and white, the sort of pink areas are all sort of symbolized by gray here. But there is a black area, darkened area right in the center that would be right along that line before I erased it. Way to go, Curly. But notice the curvature of this line. In fact, I'm at this point maybe going to switch back to the black Prismacolor. For getting this in there. You can kind of go ahead and darken to jet black all the way across here, and in a way it sort of curves around at the edge. I don't know if I'm getting that quite right, and I hope this shows up in the video, but it does sort of curve around as it reaches the very edge of the nostril there. And then I noticed, if you're going to get into details, again, at least with some types of lions, the black begins to break into a sort of speckled pattern. So rather than just having it fade in a gradient way, I'm actually sort of breaking it into almost like a Dalmatian kind of a pattern in that area. I'm going to go ahead and darken this in as well, and I noticed one or two spots down at the base of the nose right here. And hopefully that gets us to where, I guess I'll do just a little bit of shading here with the Dixon Ticonderoga, just an ordinary number 2 pencil. and show how it fades a little bit here, just along this edge. But as you come into this little V shape, it's quite tight black versus white right here. A little more of a fade in this area here. And you know, as I said, I'm going to be getting into drawing the fur along the face and so forth later on in the video. But for now, I just thought I would point out this sort of blurry shading area just at the edges of both sides of the nose before it tightens up again at the top. And this whole area here where the whiskers will be eventually does stay quite pale, it seems to me, on most, certainly in the photos that I was studying. Maybe just a little bit of a shaded area up here at the top, and maybe down towards the edges, a little light brown shading, but remarkably white in its coloring right up here in the snout region. Now, speaking of black, there is going to be quite a bit of jet black right in this area, so let me go ahead and do that in time-lapse. So yeah, all of this area in here pretty much just plain old black, but patience will be rewarded when you get to this section down here. As I began to study photos, I saw that you get a very high contrast area where white fur begins to grow straight out of the blackness of the, I guess, the area of the lower lip, although with his mouth being closed, you're not really seeing, I don't believe, the lower lip in this image that I'm creating here. But just want to point out how if you take your time, you can begin to suggest white fur, very short little bits of white fur growing out of just this area here, and then they're gradually getting longer as they begin to form the whole sort of tuft of fur, which is the chin itself. And I'm going to switch now back to the Dixon Ticonderoga to just create more of a slightly grayish effect. This fur, the fur itself is white, but I think I'm getting gray in here to sort of suggest areas of shadow between the various little tiny spikes of fur. It is sort of a tricky effect to pull off, and as with a lot of this stuff in rendering fur, you're going to see me erasing away, adding shading and then erasing it back away as part of my technique for suggesting this sort of fluffy looking fur. And in a way, this area here at the base of the chin is going to be defined a little bit by the darkness behind it. And so I can't really get to drawing the rest of this until I've drawn an area of shading back behind the rest of it. So let me go ahead and get a little bit of that in there right now. I guess you want to pay attention to the length of the fur down here. I'd say this is the one area of the lion's face where the fur is at a sort of moderate length, very tightly, very low to the face up here. And then when you get down to the chin, just it's sort of a midway, getting a little bit longer, but not nearly as long as what you're going to see in the mane later on. And I may resort to using my favorite white gouache later on, because we do have white whiskers coming out here, and I'm kind of debating with myself almost as to how to render that, because trying to draw between the various whiskers, I think I might have done that on the wolf video or the dog video or something like that. It's very, very challenging stuff. So anyway, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But let's go ahead and refocus, and maybe I'll start getting into doing some of the shading of the face. So I'm going to start to shade in the area of the face, and this is where things become a little tricky in terms of making one of these videos, because I know a lot of people want to see this whole process in real time, which, theoretically I can see why you want that, but the truth is the shading, this part of the video that I'm embarking on right now, is probably like a 2-hour process, and for me to film every single part of that 2 hours, there's just a lot of problems with that. It's hard to upload a video like that. I think it becomes very boring to watch because the changes are so incremental. And so, sorry to go through this yet again, but I see a lot of people like, why did you go into time-lapse? I hate you, I'm just trying to explain why I feel like I kind of have to do that. But for now, we're sticking in real time, and there's going to be different patterns on different lions' faces, I'm sure. But I noticed one sort of, vaguely triangular darkened area in a photo that I studied, reaching a kind of nearly black area as it comes up here and begins to join the area of the mane. And I'm going to hold off on drawing the lion's mane until a little later on. But I want to sort of focus again on where are these sort of darker areas. As I said, there's this white area, and right next to it sort of a darker area that maybe almost begins to join into this triangle. Again, I hesitate to say this is the way because I'm sure different lions are going to have different patterns. But I would advise you, if you're going to do a drawing of a lion, go ahead and do what I did and look at photo reference and base your drawing on one specific lion rather than trying to sort of invent your own pattern. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do. You're making sort of a fantasy lion or whatever. But if you really want the accuracy of something that reads like a real lion, it's probably best to focus on one particular photo and try to reproduce as accurately as you can the exact patterns that you see on that face. So the one that I saw, it gets quite... not super dark, but there's a very pronounced area of darkness over here on the side. I guess what you would say is the cheeks. And notice that I'm kind of moving the pencil in a more vertical way here to suggest the direction that the skin is being pulled in over here, that we're seeing sort of from the side almost. This area of the lion's face. And you can kind of take advantage of this technique in order to suggest the shape, right? So if I switch here and begin shading with a more vertical left to right kind of a style, that may help to suggest the shape of the snout here. Even though the hairs don't necessarily grow sort of in this left to right direction, the truth is the hairs are so very short at this point that for you to try to render each individual hair, well, it could be done, but I think you would want to be working on a much larger sheet of paper and with really high definition photo reference so as to be able to do those. What I'm doing is sort of doing a compromise. I may try to indicate a little bit of individual hairs, but for the most part I'm just sort of shading in a way that I had been taught really from many art teachers, this idea of shading in the direction that you're trying to make the viewer see. As I said, going up and down over here where I want you to feel that that's the edge of the face, and then starting to go across here to give the sense of the snout. Now, a lot of cartoonists will draw a line right here. It's like, this is the snout, Well, no such line exists in real life. You can begin to sort of suggest it by way of shading, but anyway, the photos that I was studying did not have any pronounced line right there along the snout. It certainly does help, though, in terms of what we expect to see, what we know of the lion's facial structure. You may sort of cheat it a little bit and darken the area in just in a sort of a vertical stripe right here so as to convey that feeling of the snout. Now, I noticed that this area of what looks like a tear duct sort of extends, the shading sort of extends and almost joins with, as I'm saying, the slightly imaginary area of shading here that is helping to convey the snout. You may see some darker areas right down here along the nose. And then this area here, I'm going to continue to refine, but I noticed a sort of irregular, ever so slightly tiger-like patterning here along the edge, rather than just a solid area of gray. And yeah, I hope that this has helped you, this sort of real-time area here. Let me go, I'll sort of complete the process. I'm going to take advantage of the symmetry of the lion's face to do this area in time-lapse. But at least one photo that I looked at had a sort of, again, slightly, it's like an upside-down teardrop kind of a shape that was coming up above the eye here. Specific, as far as I know, to that particular breed of lion. But then I noticed this area just outside up here as it begins to near the mane, also fairly pale up here, this whole area. And at the end, you may see me add some whiskers up here, just as you see in cats, sort of in the eyebrow area, some additional very fine whiskers up there in that area. And yeah, so bear with me, I'm going to go ahead and kick it into time-lapse to finish this other area of the face. All right, well, I will probably continue to refine this later on in the drawing process, but I wanted to point out something that I noticed in terms of these short little hairs on the snout getting a little darker in a very subtle way, just as they come closer to the nose, and then just a little pale area, they don't quite reach to the nose itself. And getting little details like that can help to add authenticity to your drawing. And otherwise, I think it's time now to refocus the camera and start getting into drawing the much longer fur of the lion's mane. Well, there's an awful lot to deal with in terms of drawing the mane, but let's at least get some of the basics in here. One thing that I noticed is that the hair that's coming out right here at the top of the forehead is considerably shorter than, I would say, really the hair anywhere else on the rest of the head. And almost like they've been given a punk rock haircut or something. The hairs just grow to a shorter length right in this particular area. And then, of course, you also want to be paying attention to the direction, as you would expect, straight up right in the middle, and then beginning to point off to the left and to the right on either side. And basically just getting increasingly longer as you go further out. Now, in addition to the sort of direction that these bits of fur are going off in, you will also eventually need to pay attention to areas of darkness. Now, I noticed, like back here, and I'm just going to do this really quick as a sort of shorthand almost, I noticed that there were darker areas way in the back of this particular lion, and that the rest of the mane considerably lighter, kind of orange in color, actually. So you're paying attention, I would say, to two different things. You want to get the direction of the fur right, but then you also want to pay attention to the patterning, sort of where's the dark, where's the light. And yeah, it saddens me that I can't go into the entire process here in real time. It just is so time-consuming to render areas of fur like this, but let's see how much more I can do before I have to switch to time-lapse. Almost like the face of a clock, the hair is pointing, up in this area diagonally. The longer the fur is, the more of a bend there is to it, seems to me, so that you might have fur that's growing kind of straight out here to the left, but because of its length, it begins to curve down. So this whole area here has that sort of, closer to the face. It's you see the direction of the fur going sort of horizontal, but then by the time you come out here, it's curving quite down in a what is that, southwestern direction. In fact, some of the hair that I saw was pretty much pointing straight down. But in terms of the dark light patterning, the darkest area seems to be closer to the face. Again, at least for the particular lion that I was studying. in this area. So it sort of flips around from where it was up here, light down here, getting dark in the back. Here, dark immediately close to the area of the face, and then a little lighter as it comes out. So many variables here, though, in terms of the way the sunlight happened to be hitting the fur in that particular photo that I looked at. So I don't want to give the impression that all lions look like this all the time. And what else can I say? As I said, this whole area down here is going to have quite a bit of shading, if only to show the whiskers and the fur at the chin and so forth. So I'm starting to sort of build in here an area of darkness in a fairly messy way, quite frankly. This is all just sort of a base layer that I will be refining and adding to later on. But suffice to say, you want to get a good amount of darkness right down here around the snout in anticipation of whiskers, white whiskers, that we'll be adding later on. So I'm just sort of building that up. And then it seems to me, compared to the wolf video that I did, that a wolf's fur is fairly predictable in terms of the direction that it goes in. The lion's mane can become, I don't want to say messy, but the hair is just going off in a variety of directions, so it's a little less predictable, just maybe a little more organic in terms of where individual tufts of fur are pointing. So especially as you get further down here, up here I think it's a little more predictable, this sort of, like I said, clock face type of thing, but especially down here you're going to see lots of little tufts of fur sort of going their own way and so forth, and that's going to add an element of realism to your drawing. I suppose before I start going into time-lapse, I'm going to point out the fact that some of this stuff is actually rendered by way of the eraser. I'm sort of trading back and forth between drawing fur with the pencil and then sort of drawing with my eraser, by way of erasing away. It sort of creates little areas of what appear to be lightly colored bits of fur. And I suppose I ought to talk at least briefly about the ears. Now, I noticed in different photos of lions, some lions, the mane was so thick you couldn't even see the ears. Others, I just noticed a surprising variety of ears when it came to lions. Some of them with, like the one that I'm drawing here has very tightly, I'm saying tightly cropped, as if it's been cut. It has not been cut, but it just grows very short. The hair grows very short on some lions' ears. Other lions, very furry, almost like sort of teddy bear-like fluffy fur in that area. So there does seem to be a variety within the lion species in terms of the ear, the length of the fur, and so forth. But the shape seems pretty consistently nice and round, just as you would imagine. And again, depending on how long the mane is in this area, you will see more or less of the ear, as this fur comes in front of it. In some photos I saw, like I said, completely concealed almost by the mane. You couldn't even tell that the lion had ears. From this point of view, maybe more visible from the side. Anyway, I hope that this will give you the basics of how I get started. Let me go ahead, I'll start to refine this, and I'll try to do my process of sort of working on it for about 20 minutes and then coming back and seeing if I can say more things about my process without actually trying to draw the entire thing real time. I think I can at least come back once, at least, maybe twice, to give you further pointers in this area. All right, well, I thought I'd take a break here and talk a little bit about my progress. It's all about building things up, and one of the nice things I think about drawing the fur of a lion's mane is you don't really have to commit to any one line that you put down. You're going to be erasing things away. You're going to be building on top of it. So any one individual line is not going to wreck your drawing. The key is really just to have the patience to keep focusing on, the direction of the line, building up darkness in areas where it's needed. I've noticed that this area over here near the eye, at the sort of base of the mane, keeps needing to be built up and added to. And, as I darken it in, I may well go back in and erase away, which for some people would be like, well, what's the point? Why did you make it dark and then make it light again? Well, it's sort of almost like oil painting. You're trying things out, you're adding on, you're taking away. And I, for one, enjoy the flexibility of being able to work at it little by little over time. Now, as I said before, it is very important to get some darkness right down here around the chin in anticipation of the whiskers later on. I think I'll go ahead and keep adding to the fur of the mane, maybe take that near to completion, and then we'll come back to do some of these final polishing details like the whiskers. Okay, so, clearly with the lion's mane, there's just no way that I can teach you every single line in the process. It's too complex. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of lines that are making this up, and for me to try to describe each one of them to you and give you advice on how to do it is just maybe beyond the scope, I would suggest, of any video, short of one that goes on for hours and hours. So in any case, I can say, though, that this may well be one of the videos where I think you do kind of need a black colored pencil, or at least some really dark pencil to get the high contrast. An ordinary number 2 pencil is never going to get as black as this one does. And, again, I don't like to tell people, go run off to the store and buy a black colored pencil. But if you want to get these results, you're going to have to find some darker tool than a simple number 2 pencil, I would say, to get the high contrast going on that you see here. But don't forget also that, erasing away is a key to this effect. And one of the things that I found myself wanting to do is to keep going in here and putting irregular tufts of fur, that it was looking too clean. They were all going in largely the same direction. And you certainly want you want to give that effect of wildness, especially in this lower part of the mane. So using the eraser, using the pencil to kind of deliberately fight against whatever clear, repetitive patterns seem to be forming, that can help a lot. But otherwise, I think it's time to move on to doing the whiskers. I'm going to zoom in here, and I am going to be probably switching to my trusty white gouache for achieving this effect. Okay, so I've got my white gouache here, just an opaque paint that you can get at any decent art store, and I've watered it down just a little bit. The trick with this is to try to get just the perfect consistency, thick enough that it becomes opaque, but then thin enough that it's easy for you to spread. So I'm coming over here to where the whiskers would emanate from the face, and you kind of have to just dash it in there quickly. I think you can't go too slowly, or you won't get the natural smoothness of a whisker. You hear me like pausing every time I do it. I'm so nervous about doing that. And sometimes you see me do like a false move where I'm just trying to get it to just touch the paper barely. And it's a little hard to know exactly how close you need to be, especially when you're moving really quickly like this. So I guess I'll slow it down just a little bit, maybe going a little too fast there. But I noticed just a little gentle curve to some of these whiskers. And I do think it's pretty important to get these in here with white. I think with was it my kitten video? I decided to just sort of cheat and make them black, with just pencil strokes, and something was missing. from that final illustration. Now there you can see there's a little warble to that line because I maybe slowed it down a little too much. So learn from my errors of judgment, friends. Now some of these are getting a little too thick. I'm trying to water down the paint, get it to run more smoothly. Now I'm right-handed, so those were a little easier for me to do. It's this motion from left to right is easier for me to do than right to left, which is what I need to do here. So let's see if I can pull this off here. I would say they are mostly just sort of going somewhat horizontal. Maybe one or two will go more dramatically north or south. But for the most part, just heading off there. And I'm seeing a lot of them, even if you can't see them touch the snout, you can still see them way over here, the extent of how long some of them are. And yeah, you know, I'm probably going to go in here and try to touch up some of these, but let me do that in time lapse, and then we can... oh, you know what I can do? Yeah, it's still in frame. I'm going to use this white gouache to add a highlight to each of the eyes. That's going to make them shinier, add to things. I did not see highlights in the area of the nose, at least in the photographs I looked at. And see, now as this gouache dries, it's becoming less opaque, which is kind of a shame. And so I'm going in more slowly than I would like, just to make sure that this, I double these things up as precisely as I can. See, look at that. That one's not real smooth. It's a tricky thing to do, no matter how many years you've been at it. This gouache thing, you really gotta keep after this gouache stuff. There's a certain speed at which you can maintain control without the sort of quivering of your wrist showing up in the stroke of the paint. And I'm trying to find that precise speed with which I can get this in here. Anyway, you get the basic idea. It's a tricky thing, but if you can pull it off, that little final touch of whiskers adds a surprisingly important level of realism to the final illustration. And, you know, you can also go in here, because this is also just little white hairs, you can also use the gouache for this kind of stuff. In fact, you know, throughout the entire illustration, I may go back in and take advantage of the white gouache's ability to give you these nice little bits of fur that are pretty hard to render by way of pencil. Well, let's go ahead then and finally refocus so that you can see the completed image. Alright, well, there's my video on how to draw a lion. I hope you found it useful. And if you did, keep in mind that there are 8 other videos on different kinds of animals that you might enjoy just as much. But I want to take a moment to thank anyone who has supported me by getting any of my books like Miki Falls or Brody's Ghost, my 2 graphic novel series, as well as Mastering Manga and Mastering Manga 2, my How to Draw books. Always so appreciative of people who decide to help me out by picking up any of those books. But let's go ahead and lay down this pencil. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and I'll be back with another one real soon.